So let's start with a really fundamental question for modern politics. Are people driven more by what's in their bank account or by their deepest beliefs about who they are?
It's that old economics versus culture debate.
Exactly. And the book we're looking at today makes a powerful, and I have to say a very challenging claim on this. It argues that culture is really what's driving the new wave of authoritarian populism.
And that's why we feel some books just have to be challenged, especially when they try to reshape how we see democracy itself. Our approach today is a systematic critique of this book's central argument.
And when you say systematic, what does that mean for our listeners?
It means we're using a step-by-step critical thinking framework to map the book's claims to its evidence. We're also applying an intellectual framework. And then we'll use concepts like the Golden Rule and the U.S. preamble to look at the ethical side of things.
And then bring it all together.
And then we'll finish with a logical analysis and a really balanced conclusion.
That rigor is how we deliver insight, not just a simple summary. And just before we jump in, a quick note that you're experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation, all powered by Google's Notebook LM, which allows for a deeper, more dynamic book critique.
So let's get into it.
Okay, let's unpack this core thesis. The book argues that populism is, at its heart, a cultural backlash.
Right, not an economic revolt.
Not in the way many first thought. It's saying this is a powerful reaction from older, more socially conservative groups, people who feel genuinely threatened by decades of liberal change.
And the economic shocks, the recessions, the job losses.
They see those as just accelerants, like pouring gasoline on a cultural fire that was, well, already burning pretty hot.
And to really get the intensity of that fire, the book says you have to look back decades. The context here is long-term.
How far back are we talking?
All the way to the late 1960s and 1970s. They identify this fundamental shift in values happening across the Western world. Society started moving away from what they call materialist values.
Materialist. So, things like economic security, physical safety, traditional authority, conformity.
That's it. A good job, a strong national defense, social order.
So if that's what we were moving away from, what were we moving toward?
Toward post-materialist values. Things like self-expression, quality of life, environmentalism, human rights, liberal equality.
And that creates a massive friction point.
A profound one. A materialist culture values strong authority for stability. A post-materialist one values questioning authority and celebrating diversity. So when society really starts to embrace the second one, the first group feels that the very social order that gave them status is just slipping away.
So with that cultural shift as the backdrop, how do today's leaders manage to turn that feeling into a political weapon?
They get that the pain point is status, not just salary. Authoritarian populist leaders, and you see them everywhere, from Trump in the U.S. to the Brexit campaign in the U.K., Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, they mobilize voters who feel their status, their norms, their entire national identity is just eroding.
So it's not just about being left behind economically. It's a deep sense of cultural displacement.
Precisely. And they step right into that void with a very specific, very potent promise.
Which is?
Strong leadership to protect the in-group, restored borders to reinforce identity, and a return to what they call a threatened way of life. The deal is, vote for me, and I will restore your dignity. I will protect the traditional majority from these elites and outsiders.
Okay, so let's move from the theory to the actual evidence. The book doesn't just leave this as an idea, it grounds the whole argument in case studies. And the big one is the UK's decision to leave the European Union.
Yes, Brexit is treated as the foundational test case for this whole thesis.
So was Brexit really a cultural phenomenon?
The authors map it out meticulously. They show how the UK Independence Party, or UKIP, and then the official Leave campaigners managed to turn what was a pretty fringe anti-EU faction into this massive political force.
The blackmail force, I think, is the term they use.
It is. Powerful enough to push the mainstream Conservative Party into actually holding that 2016 referendum.
That points to some very calculated rhetoric. Let's break down the language they used. What was the authoritarian side of the Brexit argument?
It was all about intense boundary politics. The focus was on law and order, absolute border control, and reclaiming national sovereignty. The campaigns explicitly framed migrants and even EU bureaucrats as a fundamental threat.
A threat to security, to the community itself.
Yes, it was rhetoric designed to reinforce a very strict, closed social order.
And what about the populist side of that coin? Because that's where they really defined the enemy, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The populist angle was to cast the people, the pure patriotic Brits, as being ignored, even betrayed. The enemy was a corrupt, remote elite.
And that elite wasn't just in Brussels.
No, it was in London, in the media, in the universities. It was a classic us versus them story, where us was defined purely by cultural identity and tradition.
So after the vote, when the authors mapped the data, what did they find? Was it attitudes or economics that better predicted a leave vote?
The survey data they cite is crucial for their case. They controlled for dozens of variables and found that voting leave was most powerfully predicted by attitudes on a few key cultural issues.
Oh, Jess.
Immigration, the perceived failure of multiculturalism, the pace of European integration, and most critically, a person's sense of national identity.
And what about the purely economic factors? Income, job status?
They found that only a minority of those standard economic variables consistently predicted a leave vote. And this really is the linchpin of the entire argument.
So poverty might make you angrier.
But your decision to vote for this kind of populism is rooted in your cultural values and this deep status anxiety. You're voting to restore a past you feel you've lost, not necessarily to get a better economic future.
This systematic methodology, this weighing of claims against data, is so central to the work we do. And as a quick note, our YouTube channel, Mindful Moments, offers AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques like this one all, designed to inspire reflection and rational thought. We really encourage you to check that out as we push this analysis even further.
So let's get back to the strengths of this framework.
Yes, let's move on to the framework itself. Before we get to the critiques, what makes this cultural thesis so compelling, so powerful for understanding what's happening right now?
I think its main strength is how precisely it explains who supports these movements. It's not just random. The framework explains why support is so concentrated among older groups, people with less formal education, those in more culturally conservative, often rural areas.
It shows it's not simply about being the poorest person in the country.
Exactly. It's about belonging to a group that feels its cultural dominance is slipping away, and that can be true regardless of your personal income.
The book also talks about a tipping point for these movements, which seems really important for understanding the timing of it all.
It's the defining moment. The analysis suggests these backlashes don't just happen anytime. They peak precisely when liberal norms become widely institutionalized.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about when things like LGBTQ rights, gender equality policies, or multiculturalism become official, established law, accepted by the mainstream. That's when the fear really kicks in.
The fear that the former cultural majority is suddenly on its way to becoming a minority.
That's it. When those liberal values get locked into the system, it's a huge symbolic blow. It signals that the old traditional order is gone for good, and that realization can act as a catalyst for a really fierce political backlash to try and reverse it.
Okay, that said, a rigorous critique has to look at the limits of the model. And critical reviews of this book point out that even in the author's own data, it isn't always a perfect fit. Where do the lines start to get blurry?
Well, some critics argue that the statistical models can sometimes lump variables together that maybe should be kept separate. For instance, they question whether the book always cleanly proves that it's truly authoritarian values, that core desire for strong leadership and order that's doing the work.
As opposed to what?
As opposed to just general populist attitudes or even economic grievances that are still bubbling under the surface. The fear of immigration, for example, is often tied directly to economic strain in certain communities. Is that purely cultural or is it economic? It gets messy.
And this brings us right back to the economic counterargument. If the book says economics are just an accelerant, what do the critics say?
They say the book just flat out underestimates the depth of the economic crisis in certain places. They argue that things like decades of austerity, the decline of manufacturing, deep-seated regional inequality, these deserve way more causal weight.
So the cultural fire might be there.
But the economic displacement is the kindling that's absolutely necessary for it to catch. They'd say the cultural framework might actually be masking a massive failure by governing elites to manage globalization for everyone.
Let's shift our focus then to the consequences, to what happens when this kind of movement actually wins power. We need to evaluate it through the lens of establishing justice and securing liberty for all citizens, which is, well, a foundational promise of any democracy.
And the book itself offers a very serious warning on this front. It says that even if the movement is rooted in genuine grievances about status, the result of successful authoritarian populism is often the corrosion of liberal democratic norms.
How does that happen?
It's a systematic attack on independent institutions. The courts, the media. It's the undermining of protections for minorities and a retreat from international cooperation.
And that leads us straight to the core ethical asymmetry, doesn't it?
It does. The promise to restore dignity and status for one group, the threatened cultural majority, often comes at the direct expense of others. When a government attacks the press in the name of the real people, the harm falls on minorities, political opponents, and the checks and balances that protect everyone.
So if you accept the diagnosis that the anger is rooted in culture and status, what's the proper democratic response? You can't just dismiss millions of voters.
No, you can't. The analysis implies that democracies can't just label these voters as bigots and move on. They have to address the dignity and the needs of that aggrieved population, but from a perspective of freedom and equality for all.
So it's a two-pronged response.
It has to be. You have to recognize and try to alleviate the material and status anxieties, while at the same time rigorously upholding the democratic rules of the game for everybody, with no exceptions.
So let's bring it all together. What is the final balanced conclusion after this logical analysis?
I'd say the book gives us an undeniably powerful, empirically grounded framework. It has successfully shifted the conversation beyond a simple story of class warfare. It proves culture matters. A lot. But a truly complete understanding, especially when you weigh the critics' arguments, requires you to acknowledge that those economic factors may be more than just accelerators. They might be the necessary fuel for the cultural fire to really ignite and take over the whole system.
So culture might set the direction.
But economic pain determines the speed and the intensity.
And as an important addendum, we want to acknowledge the foundation of our method here. The critical framework used in this discussion, applying systematic analysis, intellectual rigor, and ethical standards, is adapted from established methodologies used in comprehensive academic critiques. This ensures we're giving you a balanced and responsible analysis.
And here is a final provocative thought for you to carry forward. If culture drives our politics, but economic pain pours fuel on the fire, can any political solution truly succeed unless it addresses both the sense of lost status and material hardship at the same time?
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.